This is a remark that I have prepared for a roundtable discussion of Tokyo College titled Living Through a Pandemic. Professor Masashi Haneda, the organizer and also moderator for the roundtable, asked us 4 questions, which are listed here. Let me, at this point, share my screen, share my PowerPoint presentation. And here you go. Okay, so these are the 4 questions Professor Masashi Haneda asked us. 1, how is the coronavirus epidemic in your country at this moment? 2, what is the current political, economic, and social institutions in your country in connection with the corona crisis? And 3rd, what is the particularity, according to me, of my country's reaction vis-a-vis the corona crisis? And number 4, how do I envision the post-corona world? And my task here is to answer these questions, or try to answer these questions for Japan, to provide a starting point for a discussion at June 2nd roundtable. So here is a summary of my responses to the 4 questions. And I will elaborate on these points, but let me briefly start by going through the list. First, what is current situation in Japan? In a word or in a sentence, it looks good. At least the first wave of the epidemic seems to have ended. On the second question of political, economic, and social situation, I'm an economist, so I want to focus on economic situation. And this doesn't look good. So economy has been tanked. So how to restart the economic activities and put the economy back on the recovery path while avoiding the second wave of pandemic is now the most pressing issue for Japan. Then 4th, here I reverse the order of the last 2 questions of Professor Haneda and answer the 4th question first and then come back to the 3rd, because I think this flows better, at least for what I'm planning to do. So the 4th question is about the post-corona world. And in this video remark, I just talk about the post-corona Japanese economy, and I look forward to discussion with the other roundtable members to consider the post-corona world. But here today, I just focus on Japan. The post-corona Japanese economy will be different from the one before the crisis. Many changes that are happening now will stay here permanently. The new normal can be better or worse for people who live in Japan, I will argue, than the current one. And whether the better Japanese economy will appear at the end of corona crisis, or whether the Japanese economy gets worse, depends critically on our choice and the choice of the economic policies. So having said that, I have to come back to number 3. So finally, particularity of Japan's reaction to the corona crisis. Here, it's possible to list many ways that Japan's reaction or any other country's reaction that have been unique to that country or unique to Japan, since we are facing a situation that few, if any, of us experienced in our lifetime. So there's no well-accepted playbook to how to respond to the crisis. So there are lots of unique ways that we observed not in Japan and elsewhere in the world. So here, I just want to point out one particularity of Japan's economic policy response to an economic crisis in general, including the current crisis, but also Japan's financial crisis in the late 1990s, the global financial crisis in the late 2000s, and even economic crisis in Tohoku after the earthquake, tsunami, nuclear plant, those triple disasters hit Japan in 2011. So I will point out a particularity or characteristic of a Japanese economic policy used to respond to all of those crises. And I summarize the particularity here, at least on this slide, saying when a large economic shock hits in Japan, corporations are responsible for protecting their workers. And the government supports corporations so that they can continue business and protect employment. And I will elaborate this point later, or I will elaborate all of these later. So let me start elaborating on each point. And actually, there is little to elaborate on the first 2 points. So I just show one slide each, one figure each, or table each. And this is for the point number 1, what's the current situation in Japan. This slide shows the cumulative number of COVID-19 cases and deaths per million population for several countries, including Japan, as of May 24th. The table also shows the number of tests per million, which is extremely low for Japan, although I don't really talk about it. So looking at this table, Japan has lower numbers everywhere, and the cumulative number of cases is low, and the number of deaths has been low. So Japan seems to have got out of the first wave, at least the first wave of epidemic, with a lot less human losses compared with other countries. But the economy, going on to the second point, the economy suffered. And this slide shows that. And this is from Japan's Business Condition Watcher Survey, which asks about 2,000 people from various industries in various regions in Japan to answer several questions on how the business condition is evolving in Japan. And this graph shows 2 diffusion index calculated from the survey, one on general business condition and the other on employment condition. For both series, how to read these series is that for both series, a number above 50 means that more people are finding that the condition is improving, and the number below 50 means that more people are finding that the condition is deteriorating. Japanese economy, as you can see from this graph, Japanese economy was not doing particularly well before the crisis. The number was close, but below 50, and but not terrible. But starting at the end of February, the prospects started to go down quickly. And by the end of April, almost all the business condition watchers judged the condition was deteriorating. Okay, so that's the situation in Japan now. So the main issue for Japan is how to restart the economic activities and put the economy on the recovery path while avoiding serious second wave of epidemic. So the first wave of epidemic seems to be over. The emergency, the state of emergency has been lifted for many parts of Japan and looks like will be lifted in Tokyo by tonight. So the main issue is now how to restart the economy. And to consider this issue, we must have an idea about where the economy is going, where the economy is recovering to. So that is Professor Haneda's question number 4. So here I skip number 3 and go to number 4 first. And I think it is safe to say that post-corona Japanese economy will be very different from the one before the crisis. And in response to corona shock, people's behavior will change, or actually are changing, and the economy will change. And the changes are already happening, and many changes that are already taking place are likely to stay permanently, I would argue. So here's a partial list of the changes that we are observing and probably stay here for a long time. Remote working, more companies are introducing remote working out of necessity, but the people seem to like it. I just saw a recent survey in this morning's TV news that more than 60% of the people answered that they want to continue some remote working even after the crisis. And Japan has been talking about the work style reform for a long time, in promoting shorter hours, more flexible working, including remote working. And Japan has been talking about this for a long time, but without much progress. There have been a resistance from the companies and from many people that they can't really work with remote working. But the corona shock changed that. And the corona shock seems to have become the strongest tailwind for the work style reform. And the same thing for online education. We, at the University of Tokyo, we have started teaching online as well, and we are forced to do this. And I think many of us are finding out at least it can be done, and maybe we can do a better job than traditional lecture. Many students at our university seem to like it. At least they prefer online classes to dull lectures in large classrooms with hundreds of students. Use of e-commerce rather than traditional retail stores and the use of food delivery services. These were already increasing, but have accelerated during the crisis. Digital transformation in business seems to be finally advancing. Many Japanese companies still use lots of paper documents and approval by stamping hanko or seal. But many companies are finding out, for example, how stupid it is to go to office during the pandemic just to stamp hanko. So this crisis may put an end, finally, to a hanko culture of Japan. Even Prime Minister Abe mentioned the other day that the cabinet planned to look into regulatory reform to allow digital authentication to get rid of hanko and others. So the corona crisis seems to have promoted many changes, including some other regulatory changes as well, including remote medicine, and the fast approval process for drugs, and so on. Perhaps an important point that what is happening today during this crisis is that we are more open to changes. And this is maybe because what we used to believe fixed, that what we used to believe cannot change, is now forced to change, is now disrupted. And we are forced to try some new things, some changes. And for some of those, or many of those, we may actually like those. And if that happens, those changes become permanent. And as these changes become permanent fixture in the Japanese economy, some new jobs will be created, but more seriously, some jobs or many jobs will disappear permanently. So this process will require reallocation of resources, both people and money. Workers with jobs that disappear would ideally move to new emerging jobs, and companies that used to offer the old jobs ideally replaced by new companies with new jobs with little friction. But that may not happen. The process to adapt to changes is often very rough and doesn't happen smoothly. We generally do not want to move from familiar places and jobs that we know to new jobs in unfamiliar places. We don't like to do that. Closing a company or restructuring the business is not easy, it's costly. And creating a new business is also hard as well. So we, as a society, would want to minimize these costs of change if the changes must happen. And we would like to help the people who are forced to adjust following large economic shocks. So many countries have economic policies or have a system to try to cope with these changes. So Japan has one as well. So Japan has a system to protect the people when the economy is hit by large economic shocks. And it is the particularity of this system in Japan to respond to the economic shocks that I'm focusing here in responding to the question number 3, Professor Haneda. So here, again, I'm talking about the Japan's response to large economic shocks in general, not specific to the corona crisis. But we can see that some features of the Japanese system that I'm talking about here are observed during this crisis again. So roughly speaking, in Japan, when a large economic shock hits, corporations are considered to be responsible for protecting employment of current workers. And this is in contrast to an alternative system where the government provides unemployment benefits to the workers who have lost jobs and actively helps them to find new jobs. And this type of active labor market policies often includes government programs to retrain workers to facilitate the job changes. And instead of taking this active labor market policies, Japanese policymakers have relied on corporations in the private sector to protect workers. And also the goal was often not so much to ease the cost of changes, but to resist the changes. And this type of approach in Japan to ask corporations to protect the employment and to resist the changes created 2 problems that I list here. And one is the problem of so-called zombie firms. And for those people who are not familiar with economics, zombie firms are those firms that would go out of business and replaced by healthy companies under a normal condition, but allowed to stay in business with help from banks or protection by the government. And the research in economics has shown that the zombie firms have created some problems. And the concept of zombie in economics originally came from the living dead, featured in many horror movies that many of you have seen, and some of you may like. But as the literature in economics on zombie farms show, and I was involved in this literature as well, as some of you know, and this literature found the main problem of zombies is that their presence reduces the opportunities for new firms to enter the market and or existing healthy firms to expand, and thereby impedes the process of creative destruction. So in an ideal situation, firms that become out of date after a crisis would be replaced by new firms that fits the post-crisis economy. But the policy to protect zombie firms slows down that process or may stop such process. So that's a problem of zombie firms. The second problem for the Japanese approach arises from the fact that even though the Japanese companies try to protect the employment, the protection covers only a limited group of workers. The protected workers are basically regular male employees with full-time jobs at large companies and relatively long tenure, old workers. So this excludes many workers, the workers who are young, female, with non-regular jobs, with part-time jobs, or work for small companies. Now, there have been some changes over time. And for example, the government is now trying to protect some small and medium enterprises and requiring them to protect employment recently. So SMEs are now protected as well. But these workers, the rest of the workers are not protected. So under this type of policy, when the economy is hit by a large shock, the cost is concentrated on the workers outside the protection. And even worse, these workers are not only vulnerable to shocks, but also have a lower level of earnings, lower income to start with. So the ability to respond to the shock is low for these workers. And on top of that, the corona shock is now we are finding out is especially tough for those vulnerable workers because they are typically in the industries and jobs that are affected more severely by the shock. And those are non-flexible jobs that are difficult to remote work, for example, and also jobs in the industries that require face-to-face contacts and or regular commute. In a paper by Sagiri Kitao, a colleague of mine at Faculty of Economics at the University of Tokyo, and her co-authors, and I cite their paper here on this slide, and their paper shows that those industries and jobs that are disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus are more likely to be occupied by the vulnerable workers outside the protection of traditional Japanese economic policy. So these are they are the people outside the traditional protection. So a big question we need to ask is if Japan is again pursuing the same old policy of protecting corporations so that they can protect a small number of workers, male regular workers. And these workers are not even the majority anymore. So many people, the many workers are left outside the traditional protection. Now, I don't get into the details here, but looking at the emergency economic measures, which is an economic policy of the Japanese government responding to the current corona crisis and beyond, we see some policies such as subsidies for employment adjustment, which existed for a long time, and they're using this old policy again. And the subsidies for employment adjustment is actually a subsidies paid to companies that do not adjust employment. So this is not the way to help the adjustment, but to resist this adjustment. And the Japanese government is using this old policy again, expanding this old policy. There's a new policy as well. The government newly created grants for business continuation, but these are also given only to those firms that plan to continue their business and discriminates against those companies that try to pivot or try to change to catch new opportunities at this point. Grants to individuals are new as well. And this may actually be useful if that the grants are targeted towards vulnerable workers. So there's a mixed picture here. There's a chance Japan just pursue old policy of protecting or asking the corporate sector to protect employment, protect the group of employment. And there's a possibility that Japanese government come up with something new. Now, coming back to the list of some changes that we are going through and that will shape the post-corona Japan, these changes, if you look at those individually, do not look bad. They actually look good for the people in the Japanese economy. And if Japan can adjust to these changes smoothly, the post-corona world may actually turn out to be better than the one before the shock. But again, if Japan continues to pursue the old policy of old approach that create zombie firms and concentrates the cost of adjustment on a particular group of vulnerable people, the change will slow down or may not happen in the end. So let me end by summarizing my discussion. Human losses from COVID-19 for Japan have been low, but the economy has deteriorated. Now the issue is how to revive the Japanese economy and set it on the recovery path. The post-corona or post-COVID-19 Japanese economy will be different. I think we can confidently say that. And the many potential changes that seems to be desirable. But the transition requires resource allocation. So even though the economy can be better in the long run, in the short run, there's a rough time for adjustment. So economic policies should not resist the reallocation and actually encourage those reallocation to move to the new system of economy. But past policies in Japan that generated zombies and hurt vulnerable group of workers do not look promising. So that's my brief argument today, and I look forward to the discussion on June 2nd.